Hello. The city and county of Broomfield, Colorado has been built by pioneers, historic visionaries, veterans, farmers, and ranchers. Here, we honor the story of our neighbors, the Wottge family. Their story combines these traditions in their remarkable journey from a 200-year-old family farm in Germany through the loss of that farm and family fortunes in World War II and forced migration to the West and their courageous resettlement in Colorado. They had to make a new start in a strange land as farm laborers until they could again build a family farm in early Broomfield that has become the Wottge Open Space at 144th and Sheridan. I would like to thank Fred Martin for working with the Wottge family on this presentation. He's done much fine work for the Veterans Museum Broomfield and the 2022 World War II Symposium that we held at the City Auditorium. And of course, it is with much pride that we thank the Wottge family, especially Ben and his sister Rose Stonehocker, who were the eyewitnesses of this historic and heroic story you're about to hear. Thanks to all who attend and support this important historical event.
This is a great privilege for me, yet I only became involved in this presentation through a dear mutual friend of the Wottges. Since I do history talks for the Veterans Museum and other groups, she asked if I would meet the Wottge family and help assemble their story. At that meeting, I had no idea of the epic scope of history they had experienced or the importance of their story in both world and Broomfield history. Most who drive by this sign on Sheridan Boulevard at 144th, Dillon Road, would have no idea either. No idea of their 200-year journey through history and World War II that led to our Broomfield Wottge Open Space resource. Now, let's begin above Denver and zoom into this parcel of land that is under development as a recreational and wildlife area. Those who drive by will appreciate the wide open space and preserved mountain views. It's at about the highest point in Broomfield. We can appreciate that this land will never be covered in future by more wooden apartment buildings, and soon there will be trails and other public use facilities on this open space. Here is a Broomfield-produced video on the Wottge Open Space.
The corrals were down there just on the other side of that lean-to. In that general area is where the milk barn was, and corrals and other outbuildings and granaries, but they're all gone now, and this is where the farmhouse used to be, right there in these trees.
The Wottge property is an approximately 80-acre parcel at the southwest corner of Sheridan Boulevard and West 144th Avenue. It was farmed for many years by the Wottge family who live on the property.
Lived here a long time, and it's kind of, we call that our homestead. Our new beginning started here. I was born in 37, and we got run off of our place in 45. There were posters all over the place. All Germans had to be out of there by 4 o'clock. We left Germany June 1, 1952, arrived in New York June 10th of 1952, arrived in Denver on June 12th of 52. When I think back, the chance that they actually took, not knowing anyone over here, not knowing the language, we unloaded our whatever suitcases we had in the middle of the parking lot. Now what? We made a small down payment on the farm here, and that was in 1955. We're still here. They had hard times at first starting, but they worked through it. And there was a cow barn down there, and so my folks looked into it, and at first they had a hard time to borrow money to buy some cows, but then finally they were able to get a loan to buy some cows, and they started a dairy. And my parents, they worked from bright and early every morning till late at night, and that's all they did. That's myself on the tractor, and I think my brother kind of hanging on the car there. Then I had a little bit more modern towards the last. I got me a bale wagon that helped picking up bales. This one is of my brother, my dad, and my mother, and 2 of the first of our 4 kids.
Mr. and Mrs. Wottge have contributed so much of themselves to the Broomfield community. They've provided homes for many foster children in the area. It's just really neat to see.
This is our wall of the foster kids that we have had. And we have had 147 placements. Yeah, this was a great place for kids because there was room for them to run. We had cows at the time. They liked to go down and feed the cows. It just turned out to be a good place for lots of kids.
Still farm ground. I got me a little tractor, I got me a little mower, I got me a rake, I got me a baler. Now I'm putting up hay again. Not much, but I'm putting up hay again.
It reminds us of how Broomfield started. It started as an agricultural community, and the agricultural industry still exists here.
I don't know, I guess it kind of shows a little bit of the past. Hopefully it'll remain that way.
But the story of how the Wottge Broomfield open space came to be is a story that begins over 200 years ago on the other side of the planet in the pre-World War II village of Rothmannsdorf, Germany. We'll let Google Earth fly us back there and back in time. Now, you heard me say Rothmannsdorf, so why am I showing you Ratnowice? This is a key to understanding the story of the Wottges, and it took me several days as a cartography and geopolitics fan to figure this geography out. It wasn't until I saw this pre-World War II map that I was convinced Ratnowice is indeed the prior village of Rothmannsdorf. The village is almost exactly the same as it was a century ago and is obviously the same place shown on this map. Now, we'll explain all of this more in a bit. And by the way, roughly translated, Rothmannsdorf means wise man's village. At the south end of this village is where the Wottge family farm was, and still is. The farm was in their family, first through marriage, since 1748. This is a house that Ben and Rose, who are with us here today, lived in as children. In 1933, Alphonse Wottge took over the farm and married Clara 2 years later. Alphonse and Clara are Ben and Rose's parents. Here is the family, 5 children, Ben at 6, Rose the oldest at 7, Ursula on her mother's knee, Conrad and Renati. Ben and Rose haven't aged much at all, have they? Different hairstyles, perhaps. But then World War II overtakes the family. Imagine a relatively stable and reliable family life on the farm for over 200 years. About the same length of time Americans have enjoyed the freedoms and stability of democracy. Then, suddenly, it all changes. People with long-standing national traditions and loyalty to their homeland are subsumed by radical political change many do not believe in or support. Despots and their followers sow division and fear of the other. Society is splintered. The Wottges now live in a time of upheaval on the precipice of World War II, one of the greatest divides in history. The story of this family that we are unfolding today echoes into the future we now inhabit. What they experienced, what they survived and subsequently accomplished, is an inspiring lesson for our present socio-political conditions. This family photo was taken in December 1943, just a few days before Alphonse was drafted into the German army. War again swept over Germany and Europe in 1939. America was to remain isolationist for another 2 years. A neighbor in Rothmannsdorf reported to the authorities that Alphonse Wottge was not flying the Nazi flag, nor was he participating in party activities. He was drafted then into the German army in December 1943 and sent to the brutal Russian front. Things were not going well there in Hitler's two-front war. The Normandy D-Day was to come just 6 months later, beginning the Allied sweep through Europe and into Germany. Russian forces were pressing in from the east. After Nazi depredations in their invasion of Russia, Russian soldiers were not kind to Germans. They were brutal to soldiers and civilians alike. While Alphonse was away, war was closing in on the family. Ottmachau, a few miles to the northeast, was bombed. Fires lit up the night sky. On February 13 came the Allied firebombing of Dresden, 158 miles to the west of Rothmannsdorf. Imagine if your family farm was in, say, Burlington, Julesburg is being bombed, then word arrives that Denver has been firebombed and 80,000 of your civilian countrymen have been killed. The family was threatened by patrolling fighter planes. In these last months of the war, with the Luftwaffe suppressed, American fighter bombers were roaming the countryside, seeking out targets of opportunity. These were 2,000 horsepower P-47s with 8 50 caliber cannons and capable of carrying 2,500 pounds of bombs. At times they dropped leaflets warning the populace where bombs would be dropping. Yet unleashing their firepower was just as common. Trucks, trains, barns, and farmhouses might be hiding retreating Nazi troops and were considered fair game for the Allied pilots. Much of this record and narrative is derived from the Frau Irmer letter. She was a cousin of Alphonse Wottge. There is this interesting note on how her letter was translated on a plane to Germany in 2000 by Renate and Rose. So, some of my reading from here on is in Frau Irmer's first-person voice. Fearing the low-flying fighter planes, our family and other farmers left the farm in March on hay wagons to nearby towns. Clara took the tractor further. In the evenings, we returned to the farm on bicycles to take care of the animals and gardens, but we had to leave again by morning, fearing the fighters. During this period, Ben and Rose's younger sister was playing outside with friends. They found a hand grenade. Unexploded ordnance was a common hazard. It exploded, severely injuring Ursula. A German soldier took Clara, Ursula, and Frau Irmer to a doctor. She was blinded in her left eye and lost hearing due to a damaged eardrum. Frau Irmer writes, "By the end of April, things seemed to have quieted down and we returned home to the farm. The military had left the area, but just as we started to get back into daily routines taking care of families and fields, the front again moved closer and closer. Every day, the Stalin organ, that's what we called the Russian cannons and guns, came nearer and the noise became clearer. So by May 9th, we had to leave Rothmannsdorf again, fearing the Russians. This time, Clara and us, along with our families, headed into the hills, and in the evening we stopped without knowing what to do. A farmer came and said, 'You can't just stand there. If you are satisfied with the barn, come with me. The house is already full of other refugees.' The next day, the Russians came. We just stood frightened and disturbed. The next evening, the farmer offered us a very small room, saying, 'Come, you can no longer stay in the barn.' In this room lay 15 people on the floor, packed like herrings. During this night, the Russians molested and harassed the women in the house. They also beat hard on the door with their rifle butts, but they did not break down the door. Our family prayed a lot. Clara cried, saying, 'If they get in, they will trample the children.' We knew that the guardian angels watched over us that night. The next day, a lot of propaganda flyers and Hitler pictures were floating in the river. Silver mother's crosses were given by the government to a mother after the birth of her 6th child. The mothers threw them in the river so the Russians would not find them. We spent 2 nights in that small room on that farm. The next afternoon, we began the trek back home to Rothmannsdorf. Now, we thought everything was over and we could have a new beginning. But that was not to be. This same day, Russian and Polish hoodlums came in separate groups and took everything they could use: food, clothing, sewing machines, farm machinery. The plundering lasted 3 weeks. Then came a big group of Poles, and every one of them picked a farm and took possession of the property. Often there were disagreements and fights between the Russians and Poles. We then lived on our own farm, assigned to spare rooms by the Poles in our own home. In late April, The Reichstag in Berlin is overrun by Russian troops. Hitler commits suicide. Germany surrenders May 8th. War in Europe ends. Now, allow me to return to the earlier puzzle I mentioned of how did Rothmannsdorf become Ratnowice? It's a fascinating piece of history for us geopolitics fans. Here is a map of Germany long before the war. Here is the Wottge farm, clearly within the border of Germany as it had been for generations. But at war's end, Germany was cut up into administration zones that were also called occupation zones. Now, it's safe to guess what the Poles wanted to do with their administration zone, yet it was actually Stalin, along with the Allies, with little consultation with Poland and likely almost none with the defeated Germans, who made the deal to partition this large section of East Germany to Poland. The Wottge farm was now in Poland. Around the planet, World War II deconstructed empires and restructured new nations. Some were built on solid geopolitical foundations and still survive today. Others were cobbled together out of divergent cultures, races, and interests, and have since crumbled, causing many new wars. This is a slightly different analysis of this partition of German territory to Poland. It's from a Discovery Channel documentary.
This expulsion of Germans is also the work of the Soviets. They're very greedy in victory, and they help themselves to a slice of Poland. So to redress this, Poland takes part of Germany and expands a good 200 kilometers to the west. The map of Europe is being redrawn. From 1945 to 1947, German-speaking populations are driven out of Eastern Europe. It's one of the biggest floods of refugees in the history of Europe.
Now, let me digress to a modern civics lesson. Something very mildly similar to this happened to my own home and the Broomfield Wottge farm in 1998 when Broomfield became a county. My home was removed from Boulder County and repositioned in Broomfield County. Here's the big difference between post-war Poland and Broomfield in '98. No one from Westlake or McKay's Landing moved into my house and then evicted me. That is what happened to the Wottge family after 200 years on their family farm. On August 18, 1945, Alphonse arrived home and found that a 17-person Polish family had taken over the house. Frau Irmer wrote, "We were allowed to live in 2 rooms of our own home. It had taken Alphonse many weeks to get home from the war. On May 4th, he was taken prisoner by the Americans and not released until June 16. He was taken by truck to the Russian army border in Germany and then walked the rest of the way home." September 2nd, 1945, happened to be the day the Japanese formally signed unconditional surrender on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, finally ending World War II. It was on a late summer Sunday. The Wottges, still living as guests in their own home, were at church. When they came out, notices had been posted that all Germans must be out of Rothmannsdorf by 4 p.m. The Poles had stolen their car, tractor, wagons, even carts. There was nothing left with wheels. Frau Irmer wrote, "We walked away only with what we could carry, without a destination in mind. We and many of our neighbors walked in the direction of Ottmachow." Thus began a great migration for thousands of East Germans. A website of the National Catholic Welfare Conference writes, "A moving mass of people, traveling by car or truck, horse-drawn cart, or in the case of the Wottges, simply walking, are all traveling, slowly but with determination, in the same direction, away from hardship or disaster that would have overtaken them had they not fled." This describes the immensity of refugee movements during and after World War II. For a time in Otmachow and surrounds, there was some work for Alphonse in a sugar factory and farm. Wages were for food only. Frau Irmer wrote, "During this time, we survived by begging. Here, we were also expected to help clean up the burned rubble and bombed building debris with shovels and wheelbarrows." After the first few weeks in Otmachow, Alphonse was even pressed into service to repair the diesel farm equipment that the Poles had stolen from them. A recent Washington Post article, titled after the paper's new motto, "Democracy Dies in Darkness," says, "At the end of World War II and following the horrific crimes of Nazi Germany, the mass expulsion of ethnic Germans from places such as Poland has often been overlooked in history books. Yet in recent years, historians have begun to investigate this period, finding not only a forced migration of enormous scale, but also one of tremendous human cost." A recent Britannica documentary captures the broader historic context of what the Wottge family experienced. Here is a 2-minute excerpt.
Germany at the end of the Second World War. Millions of refugees and displaced people from the East search for new homes in the West. Every second house has been destroyed.
I know we were seen as foreigners, as intruders.
Every farmer is required to accommodate refugees on his land.
It was generally the case that the local villagers had something against the refugees. They were outsiders who didn't belong there.
Emergency accommodation is set up in all 4 occupied zones. Even former concentration camps are used as emergency shelters. Refugees find work for which they were once prized.
I worked 16 hours on some days. We wanted to show the people that we were not beggars.
There were many trains that took settlers to their new homeland 10 years ago.
4 million displaced people live in the GDR.
The theme of flight and expulsion was strictly taboo. You couldn't speak openly about it. And when it was dealt with in public, it was called resettlement, as if we'd simply packed our belongings and moved somewhere else.
The refugees in West Germany organize into associations. To them, their lawful right to their old homeland is inviolable, but they want to peacefully contribute to the reconstruction of their new home.
Since the end of the war has been the acceptance of 14 million compatriots forced to leave their homeland and come to West Germany. At a time when we ourselves were hungry, homeless and in need, we took these people in without conflict.
In May the following year, Alphonse learned of the last train scheduled to carry refugees to Western Germany. Ben told me this photo is how he recalls boarding the train. In the general perception of World War II German history, loading people into cattle boxcars is a frightening icon of the Holocaust. Yet, these are post-war migrants traveling west. Still, the travel conditions were no better. Frau Irmer wrote, "We had to gather at a designated area, and here we were plundered and robbed again. Then we walked to the train. We were loaded into boxcars with 25 to 30 people and headed west. The train stopped often in open areas. In Marienborn, we were deloused. Here we were also given our first food to eat. These were one-pot meals. We were very hungry, and we overstuffed ourselves, and many vomited. Our bellies were not used to food." They were on the train several days. On June 2nd, 1946, they arrived in West Germany, Peine by Hanover. This night we were given lodging in a hunting lodge. We slept on straw, where many other refugees before us had lain. The next day, a Sunday, farm wagons from the Peine area waited to take us to the different farms. By chance, the Wottges were taken to Odenstedt. From 1946 to 1952, 5 years, in Odenstedt near Hanover, Alphonse found work on the German railroad. He operated road and track gates and controlled switches. The family lived on a farm, working there, living in an upstairs room. Clara and the children worked in the fields. Now, a couple research notes. The cursory history most hear about post-war Germany is that the Allies liberated everyone and then they lived happily ever after. But life was very difficult in post-war Germany. Here's a very fine article that gives historical depth to the Wottge story. Also, at our 2022 World War II Symposium, sponsored by Broomfield and the Veterans Museum, Broomfield's own Pulitzer Prize-winning author Adam Makos spoke. His book, A Higher Call, is one of the best I have ever read on World War II aviation. He also delves deeply into the post-war plight of citizens and ex-Luftwaffe pilots who were scorned in their homeland. Many had not been Nazis, only loyal Germans called to serve their country and now hated for not stopping the American B-17s. And this title, After Hitler, The Untold Story by National Geographic, is a defining documentary of this migration. It was in church and a newspaper ad that Alphonse and Clara heard of the Catholic War Relief Services. The ruined European economy and infrastructure could not absorb these huge displaced populations. So humanitarian organizations looked to the United States as a site of new homes and communities for the refugees. The U.S. bishops and other members of the National Catholic Welfare Conference played an active role in this process of resettlement, entering into a working relationship with the U.S. government and embarking on a vast public relations campaign to persuade Catholics to open their communities to refugees and displaced persons. This is how Alphonse and Clara Wottge were able to plan the family's migration to America. They had captured the dream of finding a new life migrating to America. They began a lengthy and laborious application process with several other families. The process was so difficult that the other families gave up. But Alphonse said, "We're not on a boat yet." So Alphonse and Clara persevered. At last, Catholic Relief Services provided passage to the port of Bremerhaven, and they boarded the USS General C.C. Ballou. The Ballou was built and outfitted as a troop ship. After the war, she served around the world in refugee relocations and made a number of trips between Bremerhaven and New York. The Wottge voyage lasted 10 days. The Wottges have a remarkable family archive. Here is the ship's manifest, and you see Alphonse and Clara and the 5 children. Ben particularly recalls how bad the food was. I asked how comfortable the cabin was. What cabin? Here is an actual online image of German migrants on the General Ballou in exactly the accommodations the Wottge family had. They arrived in America June 10, 1952. Along with so many thousands of others, the Wottge family sailed past the lady, who is, as Emma Lazarus wrote, a mighty woman with a torch whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. Perhaps in our modern contentious politics, we should be re-inspired by her words that are a foundational principle of America, and that for the Wottge family was a lived experience. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Before departure from Germany, they had to secure work in America, but it was during immigration processing in New York that they discovered they were headed to Colorado. There was no delay in New York. 2 days later, they arrived by train in Denver, then by bus to Fort Collins. They were met by a rancher, Floyd Combs, who put them on his cattle truck and headed north, past LaPorte, past the first foothills near the Wyoming border, where there stood a house in the middle of nowhere. That was their first new home in America. Now, in those days, one travels up the dirt roads into those dry land, hardscrabble foothills, and it looks nothing like the green fields back home in Germany. The family were not yet proficient in English. Ben said there was serious consideration given to finding a way back to New York. The General Ballou was likely still in port there. Could they get train tickets, hitchhike? We can imagine the disappointment bordering on despair that Alphonse and Clara turned into determination to survive and succeed as strangers in this strange new land. And about this time, the Archdiocese sends Alphonse a bill for $474. Alphonse went to work as a farm laborer on this ranch that raised crops and had a dairy farm. His salary was $125 per month. Clara and the children also worked on the farm. Rose tells of having to dig fence post holes with tuna cans. And you can ask about that in a few minutes during question and answers. They had no idea where they were, what schools might be available, or how to get to the nearest town, Fort Collins, about 18 miles to the south. On the first Sunday morning, Clara and Rose, who was 16 at the time, hitched a ride with a milk truck to Fort Collins and found the Catholic Church. They met some helpful people at the church, and that led to the introduction of a farmer from south of Fort Collins, Mr. Fatz, who spoke some German. He advised that they could not stay at the Combs place since there would be no way the children would get to school during the winter. They would be snowed in most of the winter. So, a couple of weeks later, he assisted the family in getting a new job with another farmer located about 4 miles south of Fort Collins. This photo was taken there. Rose worked for a priest family for $1 per day. Alphonse managed to buy a '42 Chevy. Then, after opportunities declined because of drought, they moved to a ranch at Bowles and Wadsworth in Littleton. This was the Grant Ranch that has some significant history in Colorado, founded by Colorado's third governor. He secured the land to build the state capitol. One of the Grants was a founder of the National Western. Today, a Google search of Grant Ranch brings up mostly real estate listings. A large subdivision with golf course and shopping centers is all that most people know about this history. Wealth and success are common in America. We might envy it, but as my own dad taught me, what is most highly admirable and more rare in history are self-made people, especially those who have bounced back from near total loss. The Wottges lost that 200-year farm in Germany. They survived rather awful years in post-war Germany, then migrated to Colorado as farm laborers, which isn't exactly a get-rich-quick scheme. After just 4 years, after arriving in this new country, Alphonse and Clara mustered the down payment for a Broomfield farm. Everyone pitched in. Ursula, Renati, and Conrad also contributed money from their jobs to help make the down payment for the farm. Rose recalls much of the negotiations. There was no help from the government, no grants. They couldn't afford feed. Banks turned them down and were telling them, that's dry land. There's not enough water for livestock, and you're not citizens. Rose tells the charming story that her father, Alphonse, had dropped a nickel in the collection plate at church and then entered the expenditure in his financial ledger. A third banker was impressed with that level of detail in his accounting and decided Alphonse knew how to manage money. The farm was 80 acres, costing $23,000. This is Dave Allison, Broomfield Museum Coordinator. He works with the city and county archives and helped me find an aerial photograph taken not long before the purchase of the farm. When they bought the farm, there was no Broomfield. There was a whistle-stop train depot called Zang Spur with grain elevators, and there was this very Grange Hall that we're now sitting in. 144th was a dirt road, as was Lowell. This is where Sheridan will be much later in the future. Cindy, who still lives on part of her family farm at Zuni, says, "When you saw a car coming down 144th in a cloud of dust, you would expect they were coming to visit us." Notice to the northwest toward Lafayette, you can still see the dendritic drainage patterns of the ancient prairie. No one had even plowed that land. So this takes us full circle to that opening video with Ben and the open space. And here's where Sheridan will go in the distant future. This is the farm they developed here. Conrad recalls, "The farm came with a couple horses and a milk cow. Our parents soon realized to make a living on the farm, we needed to start up a dairy. So in 1956, after securing a loan from Farmers Home Administration, we bought a herd of 28 milk cows. By doing water witching, we located a couple of streams about 80 feet deep, into which we drilled and found sufficient water to run a dairy farm. This little business enterprise became quite successful. We ended up with about 60 head of cattle, 40 milk cows, and 20 yearlings of cattle on average. We were able to raise some decent crops. This enabled us to pay off the loans. It was not always easy, but with the whole family working together, we were able to overcome the obstacles as they surfaced." I believe that's Ben on the tractor, isn't it? You aren't harvesting brooms there, are you? Probably feed corn for the cows the banker said you would not be able to raise. New farm, new life. This page in the family album says, "Farming in Broomfield, hard work, minimum income." 1960, Ben is drafted into the United States Army, even though he's not yet a U.S. citizen. He is deployed to Okinawa in the midst of the Cold War as a technician on Nike missile systems. Here's an interesting story. In the first few months of his duty, he is working on secret defense systems, and the Army keeps him under observation by an armed guard who is Japanese. This is just 15 years after the Battle of Okinawa, 50,000 U.S. and 100,000 Japanese casualties in the end of World War II. And here's the Army having the Japanese guy guarding the German guy. The family has made 2 pilgrimages back to the old home place in Rothmannsdorf. Now, my German grandmother would see an old farmhouse and say, "If only that old house could tell its stories." We have Ben and Rose who can speak for this old house. What an evocative experience this must have been for you. The windows have been changed since World War II. Here is the comparison then and now. And here is your meeting with the descendants of the Polish family that took your house and evicted you. The older woman with the red sweater in front of Rose was a young girl in World War II and remembered you. Rose said she cried when she met you, perhaps with some feelings of remorse. Here are some before and after pictures. Note the barn door and the loft above that are still there. In the basement of the house, the Polish family discovered this Madonna with Child statue that belonged to the Wottge family back then. They use it now in their own prayers. This is the church the family was in that day when the eviction notices were posted, and amazingly, you found your great-grandfather's headstone laying in the undergrowth behind other stones. When the Poles evicted Germans from the town, they removed German headstones from the cemetery. Yet, thanks to great-grandpa, the Wottge name is still there on the old land. As well, in being driven out of their home, they were unable to take along the family clock. It was discovered by this Polish family in the basement. They agreed to sell it to Ben for $5, but then it was confiscated at the East German border, and he was not able to unravel the bureaucracy to bring the clock back to the U.S. And here is Rose in the basement where the Madonna and Child and the clock were found, and this is where the family would shelter when the fighter planes came overhead. Alphonse and Clara achieved their dream of regaining self-sufficiency, managing the Broomfield farm and raising the children in the 3-bedroom farmhouse. They retired very comfortably to a home they built in Thornton. They could have taught many of us about what the American dream really is. Rose married Walt Stonehawker, known in Adams County farming history, and had 7 children. She worked for CF&I and with Walt farmed in the North Glen area until the city bought their farm, and they then purchased a farm in Brighton where Rose continues to live. They also purchased a ranch in Granby where the kids and 17 grandchildren love to work and play. Ben has 4 kids. He worked for Power Equipment Company for 44 years as construction machinery mechanic and supervisor until retirement. Now he and Pam live on 4 acres of the original farm in Broomfield. Conrad lived on the farm, helped with the farm work, working part-time for the railroad. He graduated from CU Boulder and has worked in oil and gas engineering throughout the world, currently working and living in Ecuador. He has 5 children. Ursula and her sister Renati left together for California. They stopped in Las Vegas, where Ursula remained for over 50 years. She raised 2 sons, worked in the hotel industry, then became a stock investment wizard and a happy dog caretaker. In 1972, doctors were able to correct the movements of her eye that was injured by the hand grenade and improved her hearing with repair to her eardrum. Renati became a U.S. citizen in 1960. She married Gary Burkett, an Air Force veteran. They had 2 daughters and 4 grandchildren and lived in Southern California. She retired from Xerox Corporation in 1998. For 20 years, Ben and Pam fostered children with Boulder County. From 1992 to 2012, they had 147 placements, from newborns to preteens. That's a lot of children to care for in your home. As a dad of 2, I have wondered how my grandparents with 9 could even keep their names straight. The farm was a wonderful place for these kids to be cared for. Josiah, their first foster child, they adopted. So, imagine how many American lives this immigrant family, who were driven from their home in Germany and then came to America for a new life, how many lives they have impacted and bettered in our city, county, and country. It has been a real privilege for me to be able to tell some of the story behind this journey of the Wottge family. The Wottge name is now on this new land because of all these journeys of Clara and Alphonse, Ben and Rose, and family. It's now a permanent part of Broomfield's heritage with this open space under development for everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for listening and being here tonight. Please give the Wottges your applause, and we will now turn to Ben and Rose for questions.
I would like to add a few postscripts to this presentation. I don't believe we captured video at the end, but there was significant applause for the Wottge family. There was also about 30 minutes of questions. One lady did ask about digging fenced post holes with tuna cans. Both Ben and Rose had a comment about that. One gentleman grabbed the mic and said, "The Wottges are the kind of people who really make America great." There was another round of applause, only louder that time. I wish to acknowledge Cindy Wills, who instigated this entire project because of the many conversations with her friend and neighbor Heidi about the Wottge story. Without Cindy, I would never have become involved. As well, Cindy was responsible for bringing 14 guests to the event. And thanks to Bill Stonehawker, who replied to my many emails for photos and missing details. Also, of course, to Ben, Rose, and Conrad for the eyewitness accounts that made this story very authentic and personal. It's the personal story that is at the core meaning of what history is about. And Frau Irmer's letter. She was the principal narrator of this history. I wanted to note that the Wottge family approved the use of the opening music piece. It had jumped out of my radio about a week before the event, and the title and opening lyrics hit me as very appropriate. After all, this story is indeed a love story of Alphonse and Clara, as some of the greatest history stories are. It may be of interest that this song was released very recently and is the last official Beatles song.